Welcome to Life is Brewtiful. I'm Anthony. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about beer history and military history. It's kind of weird how oftentimes those two things converge across conflicts, across human history. Those two things oftentimes go hand in hand. And one of the most important aspects of any type of military conflict is morale of the soldier. Napoleon Bonaparte once said, "In a war, morale forces are as physical as 3-1. There's a reason the military says that morale wins wars. And I can tell you, just from my short stint in the military, that nothing raises my morale better than a good beer. During World War II, no one knew that fact better than the UK. They would oftentimes go way out of their way to be able to ensure that their soldiers on the front line had a good beer to drink, because they knew, one, it was an important part of that sense of home, that sense of unity. Beer played an important part in UK culture, and it should bleed into the military as well. But additionally, just that little taste at home, that gives people a good boost. Now, in the European theater, they didn't really have a whole lot of logistical issues. It was only a short jump across the channel to be able to provide beer to the front line. Sure, there were times where it was a little bit harder, where we saw the World War II beer bombers, but once they started getting deeper and deeper, there were logistical networks set in place across road, across rail, across the air, the sky, where beer would be able to be delivered to the front lines. That was not necessarily the case in the Pacific theater. Oftentimes, because of the insanely long journey it took to get from the British Isles all the way to the Pacific theater, there was frequently opportunities for beers to spoil, arrive with off taste, just tasting terrible. And I can't think of many things that would break my morale more than expecting a good taste of home, a good beer, and then being served a little bit of a worse version. The logistical problems largely stem from the distance, as I mentioned, but also the beer itself, because these beers were being loaded into barrels, thrown onto ships where they would be jostled about around a lot, and that allowed for increased microbial activity to sour the beers, to create those off tastes. Also, they weren't often stored in climate-controlled conditions, which made those factors much, much worse. And in the case of a lot of British beers where they were in your wooden barrels, if storage wasn't done properly, if the journey, the voyage was prolonged, there was a chance of them going flat. So British soldiers on the front lines were basically being served sour, flat, warm beer. Not the morale boost you'd hope it to be. British military commanders, they realized that if they can't bring the beer to the front lines, they'd have to bring the brewery. The HMS Menestheus was a merchant ship drafted into the war effort by the UK military to serve as a sea mine-laying vessel. For several years, she laid mines in the northern Atlantic from the British Isles to the Faroes in part of the northern barrage efforts to restrict German naval maneuvering. When the mine-laying efforts were completed in 1943, the Menestheus once again underwent refurbishment for service into the Pacific Fleet. She received an all-white paint job, signaling her new role as an amenities service vessel, and was tasked with the mission of providing rest and relaxation to service members in desperate need of a break from the conflict. The Menestheus was outfitted with a movie theater, with a dance hall, with a tavern, a bar people could drink at, but most importantly, she was outfitted with the world's first, and as far as I know, only commissioned naval floating brewery. The brewery was a surprisingly large 55-barrel system designed to brew enough beer to keep supplies flowing across the Pacific theater. The brewing system was steam-powered, utilizing the heat generated by the ship's internal boiler system, which typically provided power to the boat's primary engines. Additionally, 6 large fermentation tanks were outfitted into a more stable climate-controlled room, allowing over 250 barrels of beer to be brewed every week. The beer would then be packaged in the stainless steel kegs for distribution or placed into the onboard tavern, the Davy Jones Bar. To pilot this incredibly interesting brewing system, George Brown of Truman's Brewery was recruited to be its brewmaster. Mr. Brown was commissioned as a naval officer into the Royal Navy as the ship's brewmaster and was tasked to design a beer suitable for the seas. Now, that might not necessarily sound like a huge task to brew a beer that would be able to be produced in a normal brewery, Sure, it's a little different being on a naval vessel. However, this was a serious, huge undertaking because there's so many factors that have to be considered into the logistical chains, and not only that, but the process, how do you brew a beer on a ship? For starters, supplies were incredibly scarce all across the Allied nations. Almost all the ingredients were going to the actual war effort to be able to provide food, calorie sustainment for the troops abroad. Beer was a secondary kind of consideration. Secondly, on board a vessel, way many nautical miles away from home, from your home port, logistical chains often are strained. And when you factor in the fact that, the Axis, or is that the World War II? The enemy, they would oftentimes target mercantile as well as just logistical chains. So the HMS Menestheus had to be able to kind of be self-sustaining. And on board a naval vessel, there's not a whole lot of storage space to be able to provide all the room required for the amount of water required to brew 250 gallons of beer a week. Nor do they have the room for the grain and the hops and everything else that goes into producing beer. You would have problems with the ingredients spoiling, going bad, growing mold, whatever, but also you would just not have the space to do it. It would attract pests. You had to figure something out. What Commander Brown ended up deciding to do was he was going to utilize the ship's onboard seawater distillation. It would be able to eliminate all the salinity from the seawater and convert it into something possible to be brewed into beer, right? So that problem was solved. Secondly, they had to figure out the storage issue for all the bulk supplies. What they ended up doing was deciding to go for barley and hop extract. This solved most of their problems, to be honest. You're able to store so much more raw ingredient if it's in an extract can, right? So that combined with the fact that they were producing a rather weaker beer, something that would allow them to stretch their ingredients further and continue to produce such a bulk amount of beer, things were starting to kind of come together. The signature beer of the HMS Menestheus ended up being an English mild ale, coming in at around 3.5% ABV. And it's for a purpose. There was a reason they decided to go with that beer and that strength. English mild ales, you're able to produce them, you're able to ferment them and package them and getting them out to drinkers relatively quickly. They don't require long maturation or stabilization periods. It's kind of ferment, finish, package, send. Additionally, you had to go with a little bit of a lower ABV because you don't want all of your soldiers becoming drunken idiots, as we are like to do. Instead, you have to be able to, give them that taste of home, give them that rest and relaxation feeling, but keep them from becoming too intoxicated, losing their military discipline, losing their combat effectiveness. They just wanted to, catch a little buzz. Unfortunately, all this planning and consideration and effort to retrofit the Menestheus was all kind of for nothing. As she set sail on her maiden voyage as an amenities vessel from Vancouver, Canada to the Pacific Theater, the war basically ended. By the time she was actually able to brew and release her first batch of beer, the war was over. Japan had surrendered and the Allied forces were occupying most of the Pacific. Despite her lack of active support to the war effort, the Menestheus was considered largely a success. They were successfully able to produce the world's first militarized naval floating brewery. It was a success all the way across the board. They did what they designed to do. But because the war was over, a new dawn of peace had come. The UK government decided that they didn't really need the 10 other brewing vessels that they were planning on making had the war been prolonged. It seems that the Menestheus is the one and only to ever exist. Unfortunately, that run as an amenity ship was also short-lived because eventually she was returned back home. She was decommissioned, retrofitted to resume her normal life as a mercantile vessel. And she was returned to her owners, and the UK's Royal Navy floating brewery program kind of came to an end. It is a bit of a shame, as a soldier myself who has been overseas, has deployed and all these things. I can't tell you how many times I wish there was a floating ship ready to bring me beer. With the current state of affairs going on in the world right now, the military conflicts we see abroad in various nations, that could possibly spark World War III. It would be interesting. I would enjoy seeing a return of floating breweries. I would love to see the Menestheus too. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. I really hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned a little something about both beer and military history. It's crazy how oftentimes those two things meet in the middle to create unique and interesting stories. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to the Imperial War Museums. It's as far as I can tell, a UK government-owned site that has so much fascinating footage on there if you're interested in military history. That's where I got most of these sources and most of these video clips and everything, so I do encourage you, check it out. Link down in the description. Regardless, hope you learned something, hope you enjoyed. Remember, there's a story in every bottle, and that life is brewtiful. Cheers.